Welcome to the Deep Dive. We grab your sources, tear them down, and rebuild them piece by piece so you can walk away truly informed. Today, we are immersing ourselves in a tradition that is far more complex and, frankly, politically charged than its beautiful sound might suggest. Balinese gamelan. This isn't just about that hypnotic bronze percussion you might have heard. We're tracing its often violent history, its evolution from, an exclusive royal symbol, its use as a tool of post-colonial defiance, and these incredible ongoing global efforts to repatriate its earliest sounds.
That's absolutely right. Our mission today is really to follow the complete kind of winding trajectory of this Southeast Asian musical tradition. We want to understand that monumental shift, how gamelan moved from being a symbol of absolute, almost divine royal power, something very few people are even allowed to hear, to becoming a mechanism for, grassroots community empowerment, and crucially, a potent vehicle for cultural agency against colonization and modern globalization. And we've got this fascinating blend of sources to guide us. Academic history, ethnological studies, detailed cultural project reviews. It's quite a mix.
Yeah, because before we even get deep into the music itself, you have to understand that gamelan is essentially, a centuries-old political document, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's rooted so deeply in specific rituals and the very structured court dynamics of Bali's pre-colonial kingdoms. It's sound as political control almost.
Exactly. If we begin with the Gilgil Kingdom, running roughly from the 15th through the 18th centuries, often called the Golden Age of Balinese art gamelan, was just inextricably linked to the monarchy. It really was a technology of power.
And that link, it enforced this crushing exclusivity of sound, right? You mentioned it wasn't for public consumption. Just how restricted was that access? Were entire genres basically off limits unless you were the Raja?
Precisely, yes. Entire ensembles like the Semar Pagulingen, sometimes it gets romantically translated as the Gamelan of Love in the Alcove. Well, they were played almost exclusively just outside the private residences of the Raja, the kings. They were for very intimate gatherings, certain domestic rituals, or specific religious rites like Dewa Yajna, that's offerings to deities, or Manusa Yajna, human life cycle rituals.
Okay, so the music didn't just, entertain the king. It provided divine legitimacy.
Yeah.
It reinforced the idea that his rule was sanctioned by the gods.
Exactly that. This wasn't passive background music. The instruments themselves were often stored within sacred deposits inside the puri, the palace. And ensembles associated with really serious ceremonies like Gambu drama or the big gongere, they required complex storage rituals too, called sajan. This sonic hierarchy was incredibly rigid. If you weren't royalty or maybe an invited guest of the court, you simply didn't hear these sounds in their proper ritual context.
Wow, that sounds like a powerful cultural lockbox.
Yeah.
And what the sources make really clear is that it took immense violence to finally break that hierarchy. We're talking about the arrival of the Dutch, starting mid-19th century, which culminates in those devastating Pupatin, the ritual mass suicides, in 1906 and 1908.
That moment, yes, that's the massive pivot point in gamelan history. The collapse of the Badun and Klungkung kingdoms didn't just dismantle the royal power structure, it threw the very physical elements of that power, those bronze instruments, into total chaos.
So it sounds like the democratization of gamelan was less a conscious social movement and more, an accident of war and debt.
It really was an accidental revolution, you could say. The sources show that sometimes the instruments were melted down to pay debts, sure, but crucially, many were just sort of left behind or sometimes forcibly redistributed to the communal villages, the Banjar. Think about that shift for a second. The instruments that had affirmed the divine right of kings for centuries were suddenly in the hands of the villagers, the people who worked the land. This rapid, forced decentralization set the entire stage for the monumental musical and political changes that followed.
And that redistribution immediately gives birth to a new sound, doesn't it? This explosive style known as kebyar. It emerges, roughly between 1915 and 1930? Given the trauma of the Pupadan, was this style a direct musical response to that violence?
Oh, absolutely. Kevyar, the word, means to flare up or explosive. It's incredibly dynamic, rapid, often characterized by these sudden shifts in rhythm and volume. It was born directly out of the ashes of those kingdoms. It was reacting both to the political vacuum and maybe surprisingly also to the aggressive march rhythms of the colonial military bands. It was channeled, explosive energy, a kind of musical metaphor for a society just reeling from trauma.
And unlike the court music, which was so exclusive, kebyar inherently democratized the tradition, right? How did the actual village groups organize themselves around this new style?
Well, control shifted entirely away from the courts to these autonomous community groups known as Seika. These groups became the new cultural engines. They engaged in these fierce inter-village competitions, often sponsored by wealthy patrons. And this wasn't just friendly rivalry. The sources detail how these Seka would actively exchange repertoire, they practice constantly, and even engage in a kind of musical espionage, trying to spy on their competing neighbors' new compositions or technical innovations.
That makes the Banjar, the village council, the epicenter of cultural evolution then, a total inversion of the old system. The stakes must have been incredibly high at these competitions if communities were going to such lengths.
Oh, they were playing for pride, absolutely, for resources, for reputation. And this innovation wasn't just about style, it was driven by individual genius, too. We have figures like Wayan Lotring, born around 1903. He really pushed the boundaries. He took complex courtly styles like Palagongan and fused them with that dynamic Kebyar sound. He adapted these complex musical interludes called pararen for a much broader, non-elite audience. He basically took the high art and made it fiercely competitive and grassroots.
But the journey doesn't end there with colonization. What happens after 1945 when Indonesia gains independence? Does the new government try to harness this newly democratized sound?
Yes, it does, and that brings a whole new set of tensions. The Indonesian government did promote gamelan as a national emblem, sending ensembles around the world, which, further accelerated its accessibility. But in doing so, they also began this process of standardization. The founding of SMKI, the State Music School, in 1963, it centralized teaching methods, often relying heavily on rote learning to ensure continuity.
Ah, okay. So they kind of traded courtly exclusivity for state standardization.
Precisely. And then there's this simultaneous, almost contrasting trend. The huge rise of mass tourism starting in the 1970s. Suddenly, gamelan was in demand for commercial performances. Constantly. This, combined with modern digitalization, apps, YouTube tutorials, everything, it expanded global access exponentially. But it also threatened to dilute the deep ritual traditions, pushing gamelan towards commercialization, sacrificing context for consumption, you might say. It's a constant tightrope walk between preservation and performance.
That tension really brings us to contemporary figures navigating this complex space. Like the composer Dewa Ketut Alit, born in 73. He's clearly not just interested in preserving old forms. He's fusing tradition with some really complex innovation. What exactly is he doing with concepts like structural homology?
Alit is brilliant because he treats gamelan not just as, an instrument set, but as a mathematical acoustic system. Structural homology basically means he finds the deep, shared structures and patterns inherent in different traditional genres, and then uses those underlying patterns to build entirely new compositions. He also incorporates electroacoustic elements, focusing heavily on ombak. That's the shimmering acoustic vibrations in pieces like Saluhat from 2008.
Saluhat, House of Regeneration. So he's explicitly focused on reviving, or at least speaking to, lost styles through new forms.
He is, very much so, and he makes his intellectual process very explicit in his documentary Concert Evolution, which spanned from 2013 to 2023. What's really fascinating there is that he uses a very Western philosophical concept, Plato's allegory of the cave, to talk about this profoundly indigenous Balinese tradition.
Okay, wait. He's using the allegory of the cave where people mistake shadows for reality to talk about Balinese music.
Yeah.
How does that metaphor actually work here?
He uses it to symbolize the struggle to democratize the music. Historically, the purification rituals, the really core stuff, was performed in the sacred, often dark, deposits of the Puria, the palace. That knowledge was esoteric, exclusive, hidden away, like the shadows on Plato's cave wall. Alit sees his work as trying to move those concepts, the essential sonic purity, out of those shadows and into the public light, making it accessible to everyone. He is actively challenging the control mechanisms of both colonial and post-colonial narrative that tried to, exoticize or contain the tradition.
I see. So the sound itself becomes a statement of resistance then. If KBR was that explosive energy against the Dutch conquest, Alit's work emphasizes ombak, those acoustic vibrations, as echoes of respiration from ancestral caves. So what's gamelan's political function right now?
Its function now, I'd argue, is one of cultural agency. It's acting as soft power against Western cultural hegemony and the kind of exotic stereotyping that plagued the tourism boom. By focusing on indigenous core concepts like community cooperation in the Banjar and innovating from within that structure, gamelan becomes a shield against imposed narratives. That whole trajectory from the absolute power of the Puri to the communal resilience of the Banjar, it summarizes that fight perfectly, I think.
Now let's connect that agency in the present to an incredible project focused on the past. the very first commercial gamelan recordings ever made. These were recorded way back in 1928 in Bali by labels like Odeon and Beka.
Yeah, these sessions were remarkable for their time. They captured something like 40 different genres of music, including both the older, courtly Semar Pagulingan and the emerging Kebiar style. It was across 111 sides of 78 RPM records, but strangely enough, they were a market failure at the time. They didn't sell well, and they quickly became lost records, basically buried in archives far away in Europe and America.
So a priceless archive of Balinese cultural history was essentially just sitting in a vault in Berlin, maybe Los Angeles, totally inaccessible to the people who actually created it.
Exactly. Which brings us to the Bali 1928 project. This modern effort, spearheaded by the ethnomusicologist Edward Herbst, involved Arbiter Records and several universities. They meticulously located, restored, and digitized those original recording matrices. It's so much more than just finding old records. It's about correcting an historical injustice, really, where cultural assets were extracted and then archived abroad, cut off from their source.
The sources call this dialogical repatriation. Can you unpack that term for us? Because it sounds like it goes way beyond just, emailing back a digital file.
Oh, it absolutely does. Dialogical repatriation means the return of the cultural material must actively involve the community and empower their local narratives. It's not a one-way transaction. A perfect example happened during the restoration process back in 2002. Wayan Baratha, who was the son of one of the original performers from 1928, he relearned a repatriated piece, Kurikangara's Baratha, directly from the restored recording. And incredibly, he taught it to village children in a single week.
Wow. That is just an unbelievable story of cultural agency. The music his father played, lost to the village for 70 years, brought back, retaught, and secured for the next generation in 7 days.
Exactly. It secured educational rights and cultural memories simultaneously. And that community engagement didn't stop there. They had these road shows between 2003 and 2008. They used mobile cinemas to tour over 50 villages, not just playing the restored recordings, but showing them to communities, many of whom had never heard these sounds outside of maybe faint, fading memories from elders.
Hearing those recordings must have been incredibly emotional for the older people in those villages.
Profoundly moving, by all accounts. The project revived familial memories. It even brought back styles that had vanished entirely, like the older courtly Gambu style, which had largely disappeared after the Japanese occupation. And this work is still ongoing. As recently as 2023, the repatriation of Bates and Mead films from the 1930s led to the revival of over 20 musical genres previously thought lost or mysterious.
So the Bali 1928 project and these subsequent repatriation efforts are really proof that gamelan isn't just about preserving music. It's about restoring a community's ability to tell its own history, counteracting that colonial archival control.
Precisely. The gamelan's trajectory, it's just a powerful case study of how exclusion can evolve into resilience and eventually global inclusion. Repatriation, in this sense, doesn't just restore the sound of the past. It actively restores cultural agency for the future. It empowers the Banjar to be the true keepers of the tradition.
What a monumental journey. The gamelan truly is a sound that embodies democratization, resilience, and centuries of, fierce cultural history, moving from the exclusive halls of the Raja to the competitive, resilient heart of the community village.
It really is quite something.
The whole idea that gamelan could shift so profoundly, from a symbol of absolute divine legitimacy for a monarch to a tool for grassroots cooperation against colonial fragmentation, it really shows the immense non-physical power traditions can hold. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? If music can possess such potent, soft power, what other traditions currently treated as maybe just entertainment or as niche cultural footnotes? What hidden political or social significance might they hold, waiting to be rediscovered in our own complex world? Something for you to consider the next time a particular rhythm or tradition catches your ear.